Arden was not a man who complained. He had lived long enough to know that some things simply were what they were. The cold was cold. The silence was silence. And a holiday spent alone was still a holiday, even if it did not feel like one. He sat at his small wooden table with a bowl of soup in front of him and a low fire burning behind him. The soup had gone a little warm instead of hot because he had forgotten to stir it. He did not mind. He ate slowly, listening to the sound of the wind pushing against the stone walls of his cottage, and he thought about nothing in particular. Outside, the settlement of Crestfall was alive. He could hear it even from the edge of town where his cottage sat. Music from the square. Laughter from open windows. The sound of children running through the streets even though it was far past the hour when children should be inside. The winter festival brought that out in people. It made them forget about the cold and the dark and the long months still ahead. It made them pull their doors open instead of shut. Arden's door was shut. It was not that he disliked people. He had spent 40 years working among them, beside them, and sometimes over them on a field table when things had gone very badly. He had held more hands than he could count. He had learned the names of strangers in their worst moments and carried those names long after those strangers had gone home and forgotten his face. He did not dislike people at all. He was simply tired in a way that rest did not fix. His wife, Mara, had been the one who kept the holidays. She had been the one who remembered which neighbors to invite and which songs to sing and how many extra candles to light in the window so the cottage looked warm from the road. When she was alive, people came to their door without being asked. After she was gone, they stopped. Not out of cruelty. People were busy. Life moved forward the way life always did. And Arden had not made it easy for anyone, pulling himself inward the way old trees pull their branches in a storm. His children lived far away now. His son in the eastern settlements. His daughter across the river valley. They had sent letters. He had read them twice each and then folded them neatly and put them in the drawer beside the window. They were good children. They had their own families and their own fires to keep burning. He did not hold it against them. He finished his soup. He washed the bowl. He set it on the shelf beside the two others he owned. The fire had dropped low by the time he settled into his chair. He thought about adding another log. He decided against it. He would be going to bed soon anyway. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the small orange glow of the coals and let his mind go quiet the way it did in the evenings. There was a kind of peace in it, he had learned. Not the peace of happiness. More the peace of a man who had made terms with his life and was no longer fighting it. He was nearly asleep in the chair when he decided to step outside. He did not know why exactly. He sometimes did this, stood outside for a few minutes before bed, looked up at the sky, breathed the cold air, and let the night settle around him before going in. Mara used to say he was checking that the world was still there. Maybe she was right. He pulled on his coat and opened the door. The cold hit him at once, sharp and clean. The sky was clear and the stars were out in full, the kind of sky that only appeared in deep winter when there was no cloud anywhere for miles. He could see the lights of the settlement through the trees to his left, warm and golden, and he could still hear the faint sound of the festival music drifting on the wind. He stood on his step and looked up and let himself breathe. It was a good sky. Mara would have liked it. He stood there for a while. Long enough for the cold to work its way through his coat and into his shoulders. He was about to go back inside when he heard it. It stopped him completely. It was not a roar. He had heard dragon roars before, from a distance, and they were enormous things that shook the chest and made horses pull at their ropes. This was not that. This was something lower. Something quieter. A sound that moved through the cold air and settled in the ears like a question that had no answer. It was coming from the tree line. Arden stood very still. The sound came again. Low and broken and utterly exhausted. There was something in it that he recognized the way a medic recognizes certain things, not with his mind first but with something older and deeper. He had heard sounds like that before. In field tents. In the long dark hours after a battle when people thought no one was listening. It was the sound of something that had been holding on for a very long time and was very nearly out of strength. He stepped off his porch. The smart thing would have been to go back inside and bolt the door. He knew that. The tree line at midnight was not a place for old men in thin coats. But Arden had spent 40 years walking toward sounds that other people walked away from, and he was not sure he knew how to stop. He walked toward the dark. Arden had taken perhaps 20 steps toward the tree line when the darkness moved. It did not move the way an animal moves, quick and low and nervous. It moved slowly. Heavily. Like something that had been pushing itself forward on will alone and was finally running out of it. The branches at the edge of the trees shifted and then parted, and she came through. He stopped walking. She was large. Even in the dark he could see that. Her scales were deep gray, almost black, and they caught the faint starlight in dull patches across her shoulders and neck. Her wings were folded tight against her body, not spread wide the way dragons spread them when they were threatening. They were pulled in close, wrapped around something. Her head was low, lower than it should have been for a creature her size, and she moved with the careful, exhausted steps of someone who had been walking for a very long time and had no more careful left to give. Arden did not run. He was not entirely sure why. He was an old man with no weapon and no particular plan, standing in the dark a long way from anyone who could help him. Any sensible person would have backed away. But there was something about the way she moved that reached past the fear before the fear could fully form. He had seen that kind of movement before. He knew what it meant. She stopped about 10 feet from him. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Arden could see her eyes clearly now. They were large and pale gold, the color of old candlelight, and they were fixed on him with an expression that had nothing threatening in it at all. No warning. No challenge. Just something raw and exhausted and desperate, the kind of look that had no pride left in it because pride had been used up miles ago. Then he saw what she was carrying. Against her chest, held in the curl of her 2 front legs, were 2 hatchlings. They were tiny. He had not known dragons could be that small. Each one was roughly the size of a large dog, dark-scaled like their mother, with wings that were still soft and unformed at the edges. One of them was moving, pressing itself against its mother's chest, making a small broken sound that was barely louder than a whisper. That was the sound he had heard from the cottage. Up close it was worse. It was the sound of something very young and very frightened and very tired. The other one was not moving at all. Arden's eyes went to the still hatchling and stayed there. It was limp in a way that made his chest tighten. Not the limpness of sleep. The limpness of something that had spent a long time fighting something it could not see and was losing. Its small chest rose and fell but the rises were shallow and the time between them was too long. He took a step forward. Soriel did not move back. She watched him come closer and she did not flinch, which told him something. She had made a decision before she came through those trees. Whatever happened next, she had already chosen it. Arden crouched down a few feet from her and looked at the still hatchling carefully. Even from here he could hear the breathing. It was wet and tight, the kind of breathing that meant the chest was working twice as hard as it should to move half the air it needed. He had heard that before too. It was not a sound that got better on its own. He looked up at Soriel. She was watching him with those pale gold eyes and he could see now how tired she truly was. Her shoulders were trembling slightly, not from cold but from the effort of holding herself upright. There were old marks along her left side that looked like they had healed badly. She had not come this far in one night. She had been traveling for longer than that. He thought about asking her questions. Where she had come from. How long the hatchling had been sick. Whether she had tried anything already. All the things he would normally ask. But he looked at her face and understood that she had no words left. Whatever she had used it getting here. Instead he simply held out his hands. Not grabbing. Not demanding. Just open, in front of him, the way you offered a hand to something frightened. He had done it with animals his whole life and with people too, and the gesture meant the same thing both times. I am not going to hurt you. I am here. Soriel looked at his hands for a long moment. Then, slowly, she leaned forward and placed the limp hatchling into them. He felt the weight of it settle against his palms and he felt the heat immediately, far too much heat for something so small. The hatchling did not stir. Its eyes were closed and its small jaw was slack and its breath came in those shallow, too slow pulls that made every instinct he had snap awake after years of quiet. He stood carefully, holding the hatchling against his chest. He looked at Soriel and then at the second hatchling still pressed against her, the one making the small frightened sounds. He nodded toward the cottage. Bring the other one, he said. Both of them come inside. Soriel straightened slowly. She looked at the cottage and then back at him. He was already walking, the sick hatchling held carefully in both arms, moving with the unhurried purpose of a man who had a great deal of work to do and not a moment to spend standing still. After a breath, she followed him. The festival music drifted faintly through the cold air from the distant settlement. No one saw them go inside. The door closed quietly behind them, and the night went still. Arden set the hatchling down on the wide wooden table near the fire. He did it gently, the way he had set down 1,000 patients before, not rushed, not careless, but with the quiet certainty of hands that had done difficult things so many times that they no longer needed to be told what to do. The hatchling did not stir. It lay where he placed it, small and still, its chest pulling in those shallow uneven breaths that had not improved on the walk from the tree line. Behind him he heard the door push wider and the soft heavy sound of Soriel lowering herself just inside the entrance. The cottage was not built for a creature her size. Her head and neck came through the doorway and that was all. She folded her front legs beneath her and settled there, filling the doorframe completely, her pale gold eyes fixed on the table. The second hatchling, the one that had been crying, scrambled down from her hold and pressed itself immediately into the far corner of the room, behind the leg of the old wooden shelf. It pulled its soft wings around itself and stared at Arden with enormous eyes. It did not make a sound now. It simply watched. Arden glanced at it once and then turned back to the table. He talked while he worked. It was an old habit. He had done it through 40 years of field medicine because he had learned early that silence made everything worse, for the patient, for the people watching, and for himself. Talking kept the hands steady and the mind clear. Chest infection, he said to no one in particular, pressing 2 fingers lightly against the hatchling's ribs and feeling the vibration of each labored breath. Deep in the lungs. Been building for a few days at least. Maybe longer. He moved to the fire and added 2 more logs, building it up until the room began to push back against the cold. Then he hung his largest pot over the flame and filled it with water from the bucket by the wall. While it heated he went to the shelf and began pulling down jars. Dried thorn leaf. Pressed sallow bark. A small bundle of gray moss that he had gathered in autumn and hung to dry from the ceiling beam. He set them on the table beside the hatchling and began measuring by feel the way he always had, his fingers knowing the amounts without needing to count. Soriel watched every movement he made. He could feel her eyes on his back and he did not mind it. He understood it. If the situation had been reversed he would have watched too. His name is Pip, Arden said quietly, not turning around. He did not explain why he said it. It simply felt wrong to keep referring to the small creature as it or the hatchling, as if it were a thing rather than a patient. He had always named his patients when they could not name themselves. It helped him remember that there was something worth fighting for on the table in front of him. He heard no response from Soriel. But he also heard no objection. When the water began to steam, he added the thorn leaf and the bark and let them steep until the small room filled with a sharp, clean smell that cut through the cold and the wood smoke. Then he took his oldest cloth, folded it into a thick pad, soaked it in the hot water, wrung it out until it was damp and steaming rather than dripping, and laid it carefully across Pip's chest. Pip stirred for the first time. Not much. Just a small shift of one leg and a tightening around the eyes. But it was movement, and movement meant something. Arden noted it the way he noted everything, quietly, without reaction, storing it away. He kept the compress warm, replacing it every few minutes when it cooled, and while he waited between changes he prepared the broth. It was a thin mixture of soft herbs and water, nothing more, the kind of thing he had given to young animals that were too weak to eat properly. The goal was not to feed. The goal was warmth from the inside working together with the warmth from the outside, the two of them pushing the infection from both directions. He lifted Pip's head carefully and fed the broth a few drops at a time with a small spoon. The first 2 drops ran back out. The third one was swallowed. Arden exhaled slowly and kept going. From the corner the second hatchling had crept forward without him noticing. It was now sitting about halfway across the room, still wrapped in its wings, still watching. Its eyes were the same pale gold as its mother's. Arden glanced at it briefly. "Wren," he said simply, giving her the name without ceremony. She blinked at him. Then she sat a little straighter, as if she had decided the name was acceptable. The night went on. Arden worked without stopping. He changed the compress. He gave the broth. He adjusted Pip's position every hour, tilting him slightly to help the fluid drain from the lower part of the chest the way gravity could do quietly what medicine could not do quickly. He talked the whole time in a low steady voice, explaining each step, not because Soriel or the hatchlings could follow the details but because the voice itself was part of the treatment. Calm voices made breathing easier. He had known that since he was a young medic and he had never stopped believing it. Soriel did not sleep. She did not move from the doorway. Her eyes never left Pip. Sometime before dawn Wren crossed the rest of the room and lay down beside Arden's feet. She did not ask permission. She simply decided he was safe and acted on it. He looked down at her once and then looked back at Pip and kept working. The fire crackled. The pot steamed. Outside the festival had long gone quiet. Then, in the grey time just before the sun came up, Pip took a breath that was different from all the others. It was longer. Deeper. It came in fully and went out fully and it did not rattle. Then another. Arden set down the cloth and pressed his fingers lightly to Pip's ribs and felt the difference. The vibration was smoother. Still not right. Still not well. But no longer losing. He let himself breathe. Behind him, from the doorway, came a long slow exhale. Deep and quiet and full of something that had been held for hours. He did not turn around. He did not need to. He simply nodded once at the small creature on the table and said softly. "There you are, Pip." The sun came up slowly, the way it always did in deep winter, as if it was not entirely sure the world deserved the effort. Arden had not slept. He did not feel the lack of it yet. That would come later, when the work was done and the body finally remembered it had been running on nothing. For now he was still in that focused quiet place that old medics knew well, the place where tiredness waited at the edge but did not come in because it understood it was not welcome yet. Pip's fever broke just as the first grey light came through the window. Arden felt it happen beneath his hand. The heat that had been pouring off the small body all night shifted and softened, the way a fire softens when the worst of the wood is burned through and what remains is steady and manageable rather than desperate and consuming. Pip's skin, the thin membrane beneath the scales along his jaw, went from burning to simply warm. His breathing, which had been slow and deep since before dawn, stayed slow and deep. His eyes did not open but his face changed. The tightness around it eased. He looked, for the first time since Arden had laid him on the table, like something that was sleeping rather than something that was fighting. Arden pulled his hand back and straightened up. Every part of his back told him immediately how long he had been bent over the table. He ignored it and rolled his shoulders once and turned to add a log to the fire, which had dropped low in the last hour. Ren was still curled at his feet. She opened one eye when he moved and then closed it again, apparently satisfied that nothing required her attention. He turned toward the doorway. Soriel was awake. She had not moved from the entrance all night. The cold air came in around her on both sides, but she had not shifted or complained or made any sound at all. She was watching him with those pale gold eyes, and they were clearer now than they had been in the dark. He could see more in them in the daylight. The exhaustion was still there. But underneath it something else had appeared. Something cautious and quiet that had not been there before. Arden nodded toward Pip. Fever's broken. Soriel looked at Pip for a long moment. Her eyes moved over the small body on the table with the careful attention of a mother checking every detail. Then she looked back at Arden. And then she spoke. Her voice was low and slow, each word placed with care, like someone who knew the language but had not used it in some time. "I did not think you would open your door," she said. Arden pulled his chair from the table and sat down in it with the heaviness of a man whose legs had finally submitted a complaint. "I did not open my door," he said. "I was already outside." Soriel was quiet for a moment. "The other places closed their gates before I reached them. One of them saw me from the wall and sent arrows." She paused. "I did not come here expecting help. I came because there was nowhere else to go. I hoped only that whoever lived here would not run." Arden looked at her steadily. "And if I had run?" She did not answer that. She did not need to. The answer was in the way she had looked at him the night before when she placed Pip in his hands, the look of someone who had already accepted the worst and was simply trying one last thing before it arrived. Arden leaned forward and rested his arms on his knees. "Where is their father?" he asked. Not unkindly. Just directly, the way he asked all his questions. Soriel's eyes moved to the window. "Gone," she said, in a tone that did not invite more questions on that subject. Arden nodded once and let it alone. "Pip is not safe yet," he said, shifting back to what mattered. "The fever breaking is good. It means his body is fighting and winning. But the infection is still in him, and if I stop now it will come back worse. He needs 2 more days of treatment. Warm, dry, and still." He looked at her directly. "You are staying until I say he is ready. Both of you." Soriel looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not fully read. Then she lowered her head slightly. Not quite a bow. Something more like an acknowledgement between equals. "Yes," she said simply. Ren, at Arden's feet, made a small sound that seemed to indicate she approved of this arrangement entirely. The 2 days that followed had a rhythm to them. Arden treated Pip in the mornings and evenings, continuing the compresses and the broth and checking the breathing after every session. Pip began to improve in small visible steps, first the breathing, then the color, then a weak but definite interest in his surroundings. By the second morning he was lifting his head on his own and watching Arden move around the cottage with the focused curiosity of a young creature whose body was remembering that the world was interesting. Ren had fully appointed herself as Arden's shadow by the end of the first day. She followed him from the table to the fire to the shelf and back again, occasionally sitting on his foot when he stood still too long, as if anchoring him in place. He did not discourage her. He found he did not mind the company. Word moved through Crestfall the way word always moved through small settlements, quietly, then all at once. By the afternoon of the first day a few people had come to the road at the edge of Arden's cottage and stood looking. Not close. Just at the road. They could see Soriel in the doorway and they spoke to each other in low voices and then went away. By the morning of the second day there were more of them. A small knot of adults standing at a cautious distance, watching the cottage with the expression people wore when they could not decide whether something was dangerous or extraordinary. The children had no such debate. They arrived in a small group near midday, drawn by the simple fact that there was a dragon outside someone's house and no one had told them they could not look. They gathered at the low stone wall at the edge of the path, 5 or 6 of them, pressing against each other and whispering and staring with wide-open eyes. Wren noticed them from the window. She had climbed up onto the wide stone sill sometime that morning and taken it as her official lookout post, sitting with her wings folded and her tail wrapped around herself like a cat. When she saw the children at the wall she went very still, studying them with great seriousness, the way young creatures study things they have not encountered before. One of the children raised a hand and waved. Wren looked at the hand. She looked at the child's face. Then, slowly and with great deliberateness, she raised one small foreleg and waved back. The children erupted. They grabbed each other's arms and pointed, and one of them laughed so loudly it carried all the way into the cottage. Even Soriel turned her head toward the window. Arden, standing at the table checking Pip's breathing, looked over at Wren on the sill and said nothing. But the corner of his mouth moved. It was the first time his face had done that in a long time. The third day came in bright and cold, with thin winter sunlight pushing through the cottage window and laying itself across the floor in pale strips. Arden was at the table when it happened. He had set a small bowl of warm broth in front of Pip the same way he had done every morning, ready to feed it by spoon the way he had been doing since the first night. He picked up the spoon. He reached forward. And Pip leaned down and drank directly from the bowl on his own. Arden set the spoon down. He watched Pip drink, small steady pulls, his head dipping and lifting, his tail moving slightly behind him with the absent contentment of a creature that had remembered what it felt like to be hungry rather than sick. When the bowl was empty Pip sat up and looked at Arden with those pale gold eyes and blinked slowly, as if confirming that yes, that had been acceptable, and yes, he would like more. Arden picked up the bowl and refilled it without a word. But his hands were not entirely steady when he did it, and he took a moment at the pot to collect himself before turning back. He had lost patience before. More than he could count, across 40 years of work in difficult places. He knew the weight of that. What he sometimes forgot, in the long quiet years of his retirement, was the other feeling. The one that came when it went the other way. He set the second bowl down in front of Pip and watched him drink and let himself feel it fully, just for a moment, before putting it away and getting on with the morning. Wren had discovered his shoulder sometime during the second day and had since decided it was the single best location in the cottage. She rode there while he moved from the fire to the shelf to the table, her small claws gripping his coat with casual confidence, her head swiveling to follow whatever he was looking at as if she were his assistant and needed to stay informed. She was not heavy. She was warm. Arden had stopped noticing her up there except when she leaned forward suddenly to inspect something up close and nearly tipped him sideways. He did not ask her to get down. The knock at the door came mid-morning. Arden opened it to find the baker from the settlement standing on his step with a cloth-covered bundle in both hands and an expression caught somewhere between neighborly and deeply curious. The baker was a wide, red-faced man named Gordon who had lived in Crestfall his whole life and had never, he said later, expected to find himself standing at old Arden's door with a loaf of bread and a dragon looking at him from the corner of the room. "Heard you had guests," Gordon said, his eyes moving past Arden to where Pip sat on the table and Soriel rested in the doorway on the far side of the cottage. "I do," Arden said. Gordon held out the bundle. "Brought bread. Fresh this morning." He paused. "Do they eat bread?" "The small ones are getting there," Arden said. "I will try them on a little later." "Thank you, Gordon." Gordon nodded and then stood there another moment, clearly wanting to ask more and not quite finding the way in. Then he looked at Wren on Arden's shoulder, who was staring at him with great attention, and Gordon raised his hand and gave a small uncertain wave. Wren waved back. Gordon laughed despite himself, shook his head, and walked back down the path. He was not the last. Through the morning and into the afternoon they came in ones and twos. The blacksmith's apprentice, a serious young man named Will, arrived with a list of questions about dragons that he had clearly been composing since the previous day. Arden answered what he could and referred the rest to Soriel, who replied in her slow careful way and seemed quietly surprised each time someone listened to the answers. Two older women from the far end of the settlement brought a pot of thick stew and set it on the step and looked at Pip through the window for a long while before leaving, talking quietly to each other with the warm animated voices of people who have witnessed something they will be describing for years. The children came back in a larger group this time, stationing themselves at the wall with the commitment of a full occupation. Wren left Arden's shoulder and returned to her post on the windowsill, and the two parties regarded each other with mutual fascination. One child held up a small handmade drawing, a rough but enthusiastic picture of a dragon. Wren looked at it for a long moment and then looked at Soriel. Soriel looked at the drawing. Something in her expression shifted, just slightly, in a way that was very hard to name. Arden watched all of it from his doorway with his arms folded and said nothing. His cottage had not had this many people near it in years. It should have felt strange. It did not. In the late afternoon, when the light had begun to drop and the cold was sharpening again, Soriel told him she would leave in the morning. Pip was well. He was eating and moving and his breathing had been clean for a full day. There was no medical reason to stay longer and she had already taken more of his time than she had any right to expect. Arden nodded. He needs to stay warm for another week, he said. No cold air directly on the chest. And feed him the thornleaf broth once a day until it runs out. I will pack some for you. Soriel watched him begin gathering the herbs from the shelf. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "You spent your holiday on the floor of your cottage treating my son." "I spent my holiday doing something worth doing," Arden said, not turning around. "That is more than I expected when the night started." Soriel was still for a long moment. Then she reached into the wrapped bundle she had carried with her since the beginning, the one she had never set down, and she brought something out and held it forward. It sat in her palm like a dark stone, a single scale, roughly the size of Arden's hand, deep gray-black with a faint light moving inside it. Not bright. Just present. Steady and slow, like a heartbeat. Arden turned and looked at it. "In our custom," Soriel said, "this is given only once. Only to those who are considered permanent family. Not allies. Not those who are owed a debt." She paused. "Family." Arden looked at the scale for a long moment. Then he looked at Pip, who was watching him from the table with sleepy contented eyes. He looked at Wren, who had abandoned the windowsill and was now attempting to climb into the bread basket that Gordon had left, apparently having decided that the remaining loaf was a reasonable prize. He looked back at Soriel. He reached out and took the scale in both hands. It was warm. Genuinely warm, not the warmth of being held but something from within it, the same steady kind of warmth as the coals at the bottom of a good fire. He held it and felt the weight of it and nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he has received something he does not have words for and knows that words are not what is needed anyway. Soriel left the next morning with the twins tucked close and the thornleaf broth packed carefully in a wrapped bundle. The children were at the wall before she even reached the path, having apparently agreed among themselves that a proper farewell was required. Wren waved at them from her mother's back as they moved away through the frost. Several small hands waved back. Arden stood on his step and watched them go until the tree line took them. Then he went inside. He washed the bowls. He straightened the shelf. He sat in his chair by the fire and held the dark scale in both hands and looked at the coals and let the quiet settle around him. It was a different quiet than before. The same cottage. The same chair. The same winter light coming through the same window. But something in the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of a place where nothing happened. It was the silence of a place that was resting between one thing and the next. Soriel came back the following month. And the month after that. She always arrived in the evening. Pip would be off Arden's step before she had fully stopped moving, charging through the door and going immediately to check that the bowl on the shelf was where it was supposed to be. Wren went straight to the windowsill. Arden put the pot on the fire. The cottage was never quiet on those nights. And Arden, who had long since stopped expecting anything from a holiday or an evening or a quiet night under the winter stars, found that he had stopped counting the days between visits. He had simply started waiting for them instead.